Howdy, it's Kyle talking about the best cities and states in the US for low wage earners. We often hear in the media about the plight of the middle class and how things are getting more expensive and how difficult it can be to make ends meet, but we rarely hear about low income people from a more specific standpoint. Usually it's more the poor are having a hard time keeping up and things more generic like that. So here I wanted to look at which parts of the US, either cities or states, are the best places to be. Where could you kind of sort of make a living with a low wage? For this study, what I did was take a look at the minimum wage for each state and give a hypothetical person a job $2 an hour over that minimum wage. And I'm using the minimum wage from January 1st, 2024. I know a couple of states are raising it at the beginning of next year, so I didn't want to post this video and have it be immediately obsolete. So I took that wage and put it into a full-time position, 40 hours a week for the entire year, and then I took out taxes as well. So for this video, all of the wages fall within the federal income tax bracket of 12%. So I took out that 12% for everybody, and then each state has its own tax bracket depending on where you are wage-wise. So I then looked at net wages after taxes are removed and compared that to median rent for a city or state. Initially, I did this just for cities, but some states don't have a big enough city to be included in this, so I did include states if they didn't have a big city in them. From a methodology standpoint, there's a problem with that because certain states like Nebraska or Oklahoma or Kentucky have a large metro area, but there are parts of that state that are going to be much cheaper than that state. But for the purpose of this video, if it does have a large metro, I'm using that city, and if it doesn't have a large metro, I'm using the state as a whole. And when it comes to minimum wage, there are two very different philosophies surrounding it. One philosophy is that inflation happens no matter what, and wages need to be able to keep up. So as things have gotten more and more expensive in recent years, wages haven't kept up. So we need to raise minimum wage to make it possible for people to make enough money to cover some of these increased costs. The other philosophy is that higher wages means higher overhead for companies, and they're going to pass on those higher costs to customers. So inflation is going to go up even higher with higher wages. So I thought I would test these philosophies here. Maybe one or the other works. Maybe they both work. Maybe they both fail. Let's find out. There are 70 different geographic entities I'm going to be ranking here. So that's too many to go over individually. So I'll show groups of 10. And then when I get down to the top 10, I'll do them individually for more dramatic flair. And so here you have the bottom 10. These are the worst 10, the most expensive places to live, even if you have $2 an hour over minimum wage. And so right away, the very beginning, you see the two philosophies on minimum wage clash, with Atlanta and New York, the two most expensive places to make it on $2 an hour over minimum wage. You also see Miami right there. The city of Miami is incredibly expensive, although wages aren't really that high. But you look at 6 of these bottom 10, Atlanta, Charlotte, Nashville, Salt Lake City, Austin, and Raleigh. These are each expensive cities located within a low-wage state. And actually, San Francisco and New York might be the cheapest ones relative to the other ones at the bottom because those are the only two where you really don't have to have a car. But either way, if you're making just over minimum wage in these cities, you're probably having a hard time. Moving on to the next group of 10, there still really isn't that much of a correlation here. You have Boston and San Diego, two high-wage cities that are really expensive, and the high wages aren't enough to keep up with the high cost. But then you also have Dallas, Houston, New Orleans, and Birmingham, cities that aren't anywhere near as expensive, but the wages are much lower. But one of the things I wanted to do with this video is to show the difference between being middle class and being poor in a place, because if you're middle class or wealthy, you're probably thinking Dallas and Houston are much cheaper than San Diego or Boston. But when you move the income scale down, the narrative changes a little bit. So a lot of these areas that are cheap for middle class or rich people are really expensive for poor people. That $1,200 a month rent, that sounds cheap, but not when you're making $9 an hour. And here you'll also see a couple of states, Idaho and New Jersey. I did New Jersey as a state because you can't really separate it by metro areas. And as bad as Idaho is on this list, if I was doing just Boise, it would be worse. So again, this group of 10, no real correlation between the two minimum wage philosophies. Moving on to the top 50, you see Los Angeles right there, probably higher on this list than you were expecting. For LA, it's worth pointing out that the city of Los Angeles is not the most expensive part of the LA metro area. Most big metros, like say Boston, the city of Boston is the most expensive part, and that is for most other cities, but for LA it's not the case. But LA is still not quite as bad as San Francisco or San Diego for lower income people. And I'll say it again, with this grouping of 10, there really isn't much correlation between these two major minimum wage philosophies. San Antonio is the cheapest of the 4 large metros in Texas, and Tampa is certainly much cheaper than Miami. DC has really high wages, but not enough to make up for the high cost. And I was a little surprised to see Chicago fare so poorly on this list, but that's another place where it's not too bad for middle class and rich people, but for the poor it can be rough. Also keep in mind that Pennsylvania is a state that's going from $7.25 to $11 an hour on January 1st. So where Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are on this list is based on those 2024 wages. As of right now, they'd be much lower. South Carolina is the lowest state in the country in terms of take-home pay after taxes. So even though rents are pretty cheap there, they're not cheap enough. And Indianapolis shows that even being in a relatively cheap city, the wages are fairly low, so it doesn't do really well on this list. Okay, so now we're getting down into the more middle of the pack places. Most of the places on this section of the list are fairly low wage, but also relatively low rent. Connecticut and Maine certainly aren't low rents, but those are the two highest wage places in this part of the list. You see Orlando faring better than Tampa and a lot better than Miami, and also Memphis faring much better than Nashville. So you think Memphis and Nashville, these two places have the same wages, but Nashville's way more expensive. And Milwaukee's probably the most surprising one here, not so much that it's in this part of the list, but that Wisconsin still has the $7.25 minimum wage. You see Las Vegas there. Nevada has a weird minimum wage structure, so it depends on whether or not you have a job with benefits, but either way, Las Vegas ends up in the middle of the pack for this list. Okay, so now we're into the better half of this list. This is where your low incomes go a little bit further. Another motley crew of places here, some rural states and some expensive state capitals. I think Denver is probably the biggest surprise in this part of the list, being that it's a pretty expensive city, but the wages are fairly high. And you look at the states of Alaska, Kansas, Wyoming, Mississippi, Iowa, all right in the same area. And just like with Philadelphia, Pittsburgh wouldn't have been this high on the list without counting the 2024 minimum wage. And Mississippi being here shows that you can have a really low wage, but the rent is really low, you can still do okay. And I'm not surprised to see Richmond and Sacramento on here. These are often considered expensive states, but why these states are expensive isn't because of their capital cities. Alright, so now we're getting into the top 20 where your low wages go even further. And the one that really stands out to me is Seattle, that it ranks this high. Do keep in mind that Washington does have the highest minimum wage in the country at $15.74. So for this study, I'm looking at $17.74. But it should be no surprise that many of the cities ranking this high are in the Midwest. And you'll see Jacksonville here ranked very high, whereas the other metros in Florida are much more expensive. For Minneapolis, I did look at just Minneapolis. St. Paul isn't that much different, so it wouldn't have made a huge difference for this list, but these numbers are just for Minneapolis. Baltimore is a lot of it's pretty rough, so you can get some relatively high Maryland wages and be in kind of a area in Baltimore, but be doing okay financially. And it's worth noting that North Dakota is the only place on this part of the list that has the $7.25 minimum wage. Okay, so that brings us to the top 10. I'm going to count these down one at a time. At number 10 is Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska has a $10.50 minimum wage and relatively low rents. And Omaha is the most expensive part of Nebraska, so you can take these wages to other cities in the state and do even better. At number 9 is Portland, Oregon. It might be a bit of a surprise to see Portland ranked so high, but it does have a $15.45 minimum wage. So you look at Seattle ranked at number 19, Portland has almost the same minimum wage, but cheaper rents. At number 8 is Detroit, Michigan. You figure Detroit probably had to do pretty well on this list. The minimum wage in Michigan is $10 an hour, and the rents are fairly low in Detroit. And to put that in perspective, Detroit and Memphis have about the same median rent, but Detroit's minimum wage is almost $3 an hour higher. And even if you go outside of the city into some of the inner ring suburbs, it's still pretty inexpensive there. At number 7 is Cleveland. I recently did a video on Cleveland and I liked it a lot. I was surprised at just how much of the city was not so run down. The wages in Ohio are okay and the housing costs are low, so Cleveland does well on this list. So it should be not much of a surprise that at number 6 is Cincinnati. Cincinnati and Cleveland have the same wages, but the median rent in Cincinnati is just slightly lower. And you had Columbus at number 15, you got Cleveland and Cincinnati at 7 and 6, so Ohio is a pretty good state for this list. I think part of the reason for this is that Ohio is the only state in the country that has an income tax, but zero income tax for low-wage earners. You have to make over $26,000 a year to pay any type of income tax in Ohio. So low income earners in Ohio bring more of their money home, plus houses there are relatively cheap. Moving on to number 5 is Fresno, California. I figured Fresno was going to be high on this list. You have high California wages plus relatively low rents and housing costs in Fresno. So think about if you live in San Jose, your minimum wage is the same as in Fresno, but your rent is literally twice as much. With median rent in Fresno being $1,700, and that's gone up a lot in the past year, that's relatively affordable if you're making $17.50 an hour. And in a very similar boat to Fresno is number 4, Buffalo, New York. High New York wages, low Buffalo rents equal a good ratio here. Now, New York does have an interesting system where it's $15 an hour minimum wage for the New York City metro area, but $14.20 for upstate, and that's where Buffalo is. But $14.20 is a lot of money for an area with low rents and low housing costs like Buffalo. I do like Buffalo, and I'm not surprised to see it on this list. Man, but those winters. At number 3 on this list, the state of West Virginia. And the reason why West Virginia does so well on this list is because its minimum wage is $8.75, which is still really low, but that's $1.50 more than just about everywhere else in the South. And you combine that with the fact that the rents are actually lower in West Virginia than most of the rest of the South. And yes, wages for the middle class and upper class in West Virginia are very low, but at the bottom end of the scale, $1.50 more per hour compared to the other southern states is actually pretty good. At number 2 is the state of South Dakota. So it's a pretty similar situation here, a state with low median rent but a minimum wage higher than the national minimum. With minimum wage in South Dakota being $10.80, that's quite a bit for how low the rents are. And South Dakota is a very low tax state. Of all these places in the top 10, it's the lowest tax. But it doesn't give you the best opportunity to make it with a low wage job because number 1 is Arkansas. And with Arkansas, it's the same as West Virginia and South Dakota. It's a state with low housing costs, but a minimum wage higher than the national minimum. Minimum wage in Arkansas is surprisingly $11 an hour, which is a full $3.75 over the rest of the South. Imagine you work a low-wage job in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Memphis. You might have a friend doing the exact same job across the border in Arkansas making $3 an hour more. Their rent is the same, their AT&T and Verizon bill is the same, they buy stuff on Amazon for the same price as you do, but they're making $3 an hour more. The biggest negative with Arkansas is it has the second highest sales tax rate in the country, and that really hurts poor people, but when you have $11 an hour, which is way higher than the rest of the South, it makes up for it. So the overall findings are that there's a general trend that the places that have a low cost of living but minimum wage above the national minimum tend to be the places where your low wages will go the furthest. And most of the places at the bottom were expensive cities located in states with low wages. But you also have places like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, really high minimum wage to supposedly make up for that cost of living, but it doesn't. So I guess the overall message to this video would be that $7.25 is nowhere near enough money to make it anywhere in the US regardless of how cheap it is. And $3,000 a month rent is way too high regardless of how high your minimum wage is. So that's my analysis of the best parts of the US for low-income earners, and things are very expensive in the US, but it is possible to have a low-income job and still be able to make it sort of in many parts of the US. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King signing out. I want to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please check out my Patreon page with the link in the description. And as always, thank you very much.